Hi, it's Eric. I was thinking a little bit about how to theme Pewter, and I accidentally learned something that I didn't know about how JavaScript can interact with CSS. At first, I was imagining changing something like the color of window borders. And in order to do this, I was imagining that you have to, once a user has applied a preference for a color, apply that color to all the windows that are currently open, track that in some place in memory, and then every time a new window is open, apply that style change with some JavaScript code. It turns out there's a much easier way to do something like that, and it's with an interface that I didn't know about for some time. But there's a property on document called stylesheets, and this is different from iterating over the link elements within the head element of the page. Document.stylesheets has several items, one for each style sheet, and each of these is a CSS style sheet object. So it's type of, it's going to be object, so that doesn't really help. But if I do .constructor.name, I should get CSS style sheet. And the CSS style sheet class has a method called add rule. So how far can we take this? I was trying to think of how to organize this. It seems a little strange to add CSS rules to an arbitrary style sheet that was loaded onto the page, and I couldn't find a reliable way to create a new one. If I tried to create a link element with no href attribute, I wasn't able to call add rule on it. So what I decided to do was make this empty style sheet and just load it into the page. This is a manifest file that the backend loads in, and then it inserts everything into the head of the HTML that it sends for the single page application here. So it's going to load theme.css. Theme.css will have nothing on it, and then we can access it. It seems pretty reliably by calling .item and then doing document.stylesheets.length -1. And this is always going to be the it should have the href property on it, I think. Yeah, that's not it. Anyhow, it's always going to be theme.css, or so it seemed earlier, unless, well. So what I was about to say is it seems pretty reliably that it gives us the last CSS file loaded, which is the one that I added. However, that does not appear to be true, because the one I'm getting right now has CSS rules. If I look in the list of rules that are not in this file, it looks like they're from, I'm not sure, something else, completely different. The last loaded CSS file is theme.css, so this one might be dynamically loaded, and that's kind of interesting. So I'm going to check the length because it was 4 last time I checked, and right now it's 5. So yeah, there was something that wasn't loaded the last time I tested this. So I'm going to reload the page and see if I get that consistently. Let's see, the length is 4 at the moment, and maybe that will change. For the moment, it is theme.css. I think it was when I opened this directory. I think there's a library that we're using. Yep, there's a library that we're using that adds a style. So if we were to get the last style sheet at load time when init GUI is called, then I think it is safe to say we reliably get this empty style sheet that I created, and we can store that object somewhere and access it from other places. Just remember which one was the right one, and then we can add rules to it. So let's try adding a rule to it. I'm going to start off with, I'm going to call this SS for style sheet. I'm going to start off with adding a rule for the taskbar, which I believe just has the class taskbar. Couldn't get simpler than that, and setting the background color to orange. Ah, look at that, we have themes apparently. Let's see what other CSS properties we can change on this. Alright, I found the Pewter window element. So this is UIWindow.js, presumably, and we can see the window head, which is probably what I want to change the color of, has the class window head. So what happens if we make window head orange? That seems to work as well. It's a little bit, oh, it's just the inactive color. I see. So that seems to be working pretty well as well. So this is like almost like a complete personalization of Pewter. The only gripe I have is the sidebar. Um, when it's not in this style, if I reload the page here, it kind of looks like it should be part of the title bar. The seam is a bit more noticeable because I had it zoomed in, and zoom has some interesting consequences with respect to how things are aligned to each other as far as borders go. But I've always thought the background should be kind of tied to this background in some way. That said, that might not look great. I'm not a graphic designer, but it would be nice to be able to style that as well. Alright, so let's try just making everything orange. First I'm going to see which style sheet I'm looking at right now. This is not the one that's called theme, right? Because our length is this takes a bit longer to type than I'd like it to. So right now -2 will give me the one I wanted. But so SS add rule, we'll do taskbar or window head or window sidebar. Whoops. And we're going to make them all orange. Yeah, so that seems to work. Now that bright orange color is not a great example of what a theme would look like because we do have this transparency effect here, and it would be really cool to preserve that. So if we look at the existing styles, which is a bit difficult because we override the right click for Pewter's right click menu, but if I go over here, it's pretty easy to get to window head again. I can look at the existing style and I'll see we have this RGBA. I can choose a color here. I'm going to choose an orangish. I'm going to make it a little bit more saturated. So all the personalization colors could be like about that saturation as an example. I'm going to make it a little more transparent as well, but I think that would also be a setting because that just seems familiar to me for some reason. So if I copy this, um, now I think we have a really easy color situation. Actually, I want this as HSL. Can I change this to HSL? If I change this to HSL, there's some really cool things that we can do. RGB to HSL. By really cool things, I mean it's just less work. Wow, that didn't work how I wanted it to. This one? I'm just going to click links until I find something that doesn't make me type, let's be real. Alright, now we got HSL. So what I was trying to say while stumbling over words is if I use this HSL color instead, it's much easier to get different hues because I can just do that. And then I can say hue equals 20. I don't even know what color that's going to be, but it's going to be a random color. And we get this thing because SS is undefined because I didn't do that yet. And now we have, yeah, all the personalization settings anyone could ask for. So now I just got to figure out what the bounds of hue is. I think it goes to 255. If it does, 255 is going to be red. It's purple. And 0 is not purple, is it? Maybe it's 360. I think it's 360. Yeah, it's like a wheel. Okay, cool. So yeah, we have all the personalization settings now. That color actually looks really nice on that background. So now it's just a matter of figuring out configuration and a settings menu. I'm going to plan this out a little bit. We're going to have a settings dialog that will allow us to change some properties of the theme with some sliders. So you could have hue, saturation, opacity. I think those are the settings. And then this is going to need to update something. Ideally, I want one component that's going to, or a controller I should say, that's going to manage updating the state of the user interface and managing configuration. So this call is going to say change the configuration. See if I can get some text here. Update config. And then this box is going to do two things. It's going to update the configuration it's stored in memory. It's going to update a file on the file system. So in my mind, files look like this. They're always a page with a folded corner. And it's going to update the CSS rules that are being stored. So I'll just write CSS. And then on load, this controller here, this class, it's going to have a method on it that's called by init GUI, and it's going to load whatever's in the file into memory, and then apply the changes to the CSS rules. That should be simple enough. I'm going to add a class here now, which will be the controller to manage themes. This seems like a pretty good place to import it. It's where a lot of high-level things are imported. But there's another thing I want to do here. This init GUI function, it does most of the boot process. And one thing that helped me out a lot in Pewter's backend was implementing a conventional way for parts of the program to handle load time. If we look over in core module, which is the backend, we register all of these services with the backend the backend's core controller, which is called kernel. And kernel, it goes through and where does it do this? In boot, I believe it calls services, boot services. And boot services, it's just a loop that calls, where is that? It awaits services.ready. Services.ready is resolved when we call init on all of the services, which is actually in container.js. But anyway, when init's called on all the services, we can do everything else. But init's not called on the first service until all the services have been instantiated. So we can have circular dependencies between things. So like the error service could depend on the logging service and vice versa. It's not going to cause an issue at load time. Implementing something like that in the UI side right now is not that difficult, actually. We just need to do something at the end of boot, which is presumably here. And we're going to launch services. I guess I'll just do it like that. Is this function async? I'm going to check that first. It is async, so I'm actually going to do that as well. And then I'm just going to const launch services equals async function. And now we can have a list of services. One thing I realized I had to do also when I was working on backend is all of the services used to not extend a common base class, but having them extend a common base class made it a lot easier to manage initializing them all after they're all put in the services container, and I can add new features to the services API and add some no-op operations to that base class. So that's very helpful for that purpose. One thing I'm going to do with these services, there's a helpers.js here. I'm going to add definitions.js, and these will be for things like the service class is what I'm calling it, which right now is the only thing that's going to be in here. And theme service will then extend service. And I wonder if it's going to actually do that thing that it just did, and it did do that thing that it just did. That's pretty great. I'm going to make an async function called init just to copy the same convention that we use on the back-end side. For front end, I'm not going to right now introduce the same complexity of the services container in backend, because if I look at the services container, it looks like that, and it might we might not need all of that in GUI. So instead, I'm just going to make a list called services, and I'm going to push a new theme service into it, and theme service isn't exported, so it's not giving me that. There we go. It imported it for me. Pushing that, it needs a name. I found that having identifiers for the services container in backend was helpful because we can use a configurable class multiple times to implement different services. So that's done for entity storage. So the service that stores apps and subdomains, those are the same implementation, just with different settings. They use a different object model, and they store in different tables. So we have the theme service, and now I'm just going to iterate over all the services and call init on all of the services. Which right now there's one, so like this code doesn't really do that much yet, but it's going to work wonders later on once we have more of these things. I'm curious about this. Okay, so what Copilot wanted to do was create a style element of type CSS and set inner HTML on the style to some CSS. I assume that probably does work. Let's take a look at that, because that's different than the approach that I was going to take. I think I like the approach I was going to take better, but I want to see if this works anyway. For some reason it didn't let me copy text, so I'm just going to use the mouse. To create that, and what did it do? It set the type. That's probably not super important. S.inner HTML equals, what's a change that we're going to notice? Document.head.appendChild s. Okay, yeah, so that appears to work. For some reason, Pewter doesn't go upside down properly. Oh, that's neat. It goes in the reverse of the mouse when I drag it, which I didn't expect, but that is kind of interesting. Uh, but I still have to click the window title bar. It's just, yeah, it makes perfect sense that it's doing that. I understand why, because we're looking at the coordinates with respect to the document, or the window viewport or something, rather than the body. So that's pretty neat. Anyway, a little bit of a fun distraction. I'm gonna get back to what I meant to do, which was, well, acknowledging that this works, but that this isn't what we want to do, because we want to be able to replace the style rules in here, and I'm not sure that it will let us do that. Actually, it might. I believe it probably will. And the more I think about it, this could make sense. So we're going to do this as one of these things to make it easier to think about in my brain place where thinking happens. Just going to go in a block like this. So we've got style element, setting the inner HTML, and I want to see if I can just keep repeating this with different styles for the same selector. See if it'll let me do that. Okay, it seems that it will let me do that. It'll probably keep letting me do that. It's kind of weird because we're making the styles more complex. Um, the cascade of the style sheets, of the cascading style sheets. We're making the cascade of the cascading style sheets deeper. I assume if I look at these rules, um, that's true with the rules I was using before though. Actually, we can see it's like override, 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 override. So whenever I add a rule, um, with my previous method, I'm not even replacing it. So we'll see if we can change that so I am replacing it, if that's possible. Let's first make sure that this is still working. That's still working. Um, yeah, that makes sense because this wasn't changing the rotation of the page. Let's see if we can find any other methods here. There's delete rule. There's insert rule. What's the difference between insert rule and add rule? That might be exactly what I'm looking for. So add rule. This is deprecated. That's good to know. Insert rule. It doesn't say if it's going to replace instead. I suspect it'll do the same thing. Um, 1 second though, I'm going to change the rotation of the page back to something reasonable like upside down. And I'm going to try insert rule. So this actually returns the index. Failed to execute insert rule. It has different syntax. What's the syntax of insert rule? Rule, index. Okay. They don't want us separating out the selector anymore. That seems a little odd to me because there's JavaScript APIs, specifically this one, that do parsing of a selector on its own. Um, but yeah, it seems that this API wants us to put the brackets in. There probably is a reason for that. Let's see if we can change the hue still. That doesn't seem to be working. This is a dilemma. It doesn't throw an error here. It's the method that's not deprecated. And for some reason, of which I don't know, doesn't work. So I'm going to try reloading the page in case it was just something I did with the state of things. We're getting an error in init GUI because I have incomplete changes here. What in particular is causing the issue? It can't be the call to init. Script on error, failed to load script at URL. Well, geez, that's not helpful. It can't load themeservice.js, although it did. Definitions? 404. Ah, there we go. It can't load definitions because it doesn't end with .js? Yeah, that was the reason why. Okay, so VS Code did a thing that was incorrect, I guess. Interesting. What was I checking? Oh yeah, this insert rule thing. Oh, SS is undefined. That actually makes sense for the moment. Um, can we get that back? Not easily. What's this? We want to do -2 to get that. This one. Yeah, that's working now. Okay, we get index 0, also index 0. We can only do it once. Okay. So it seems that I'm using it correctly. Replace. It asynchronously replaces the content of a style sheet with the content passed into it. You know what? This isn't a bad idea. It's pretty reasonable that we generate all the CSS created by themes. Um, can't call replace on non-constructed CSS style sheets. What does it mean for this to be non-constructed? We need to create it with the constructor. This might be a good thing. Might be a blessing in disguise. I can get rid of that pseudo theme.css file. So we can call this style sheet. Test style sheet is gonna be equal to that. And I might be able to just do this. Test SS. That doesn't seem to make any difference. This example over here doesn't actually apply it to the page in any way. This might actually be a question for ChatGPT. I know how to construct one, but how do I put it on the page? Does it have a push method? Oh, it does. Oh, look at that. There we go. Now we're in business. This is the most correct way to do this, I think. Cool. We'll do it that way. UIAlert. UIAlert is a relatively simple class. Let me just move these out of the way. And so using it as a reference will probably be helpful to make UI theme dialog, which is probably, I guess it's UI window theme dialog because it's a window. So these are this style of class where it's a function. And we need to export it somehow. How is it exported here? Export default UI alert. Okay, I'll do the same thing. I'll keep it consistent. So UI theme dialog, and this creates a UI window. That is the thing that I most need code from. The the thing that is most applicable to this situation exactly. I guess this is an asynchronous function, right? Return new promise. Okay, I'm just not going to do that. I'm just going to do this. I prefer that. Well, I guess I should say I prefer that. But if I'm thinking about what I prefer to use a const. I spelled function wrong, or I just wrote const equal instead of, yeah. Here's one thing that's kind of a pain. If you set a function as a const variable, the name property on the function goes away. So for debugging purposes, it can actually be helpful to redundantly have the name of the function in here, which looks awful, but yeah, it's advantageous. The recording was getting a little bit lengthy, so I did a bunch of this first, and now I'm just going to go over what I did. So I added, let's see, theme service. I changed that up a bit. So instead of getting some CSS body or the selectors, we just get values, and these values are themable things, and then the reload method knows how to turn that into CSS. So that's a lot simpler. There's a default state. These are all the default values, um, kind of. And then UI window theme dialog is where probably most of the code that I had to write is. So we add UI window, we grab the theme service, and then I created a function that creates a slider and then gives you some things that you can do with a slider. The things you can do with a slider are append it to an element or listen for changes. Then I have a common callback for slider changes, and all it does is it sets the value of that slider to the state variable with its name. Actually, that should be name because I did like a label can be label or name thing so that those can be distinct. Anyhow, then we apply the current object to theme service. Theme service apply calls reload, and that's when we do that. And then I just render all the sliders. So the end result of that is this. If I grab this thing here, I can just change all the colors. So that's this is the hue here, or sorry, this is the saturation, lightness, transparency. So yeah, overall, I am pretty happy with that. I added a PR for this on GitHub. It's still in draft as of this recording, but you can see I put some screenshots here and all the 7 files that were changed, totaling at only 215 additions for this. So it's not a very large change. So once I add configuration, saving and loading, so saving and loading to JSON file in the user's home directory, then this will be complete. And right now it's up on this branch, and anyone can check out that branch and play around with it. So until next time.